joining us, but it is time, so we are going to make a start. Thank you for all of you who have joined us for this year's annual Steve Biko Bioethics lecture. As we know, on this day, we always remember the death of Steve Biko at the hands of the apartheid security police back in 1977. And so the focus of this lecture tends to be on justice and on human well-being. And we focus this session on possibly a new kind of justice for many of us, the notion of climate justice. Earlier this year at our Ethics Alive symposium, we introduced a sort of mini theme for this year, focusing on climate change and bioethics. And Professor Colleen Vogel spoke to us then directly about climate change and health. And we're going to continue looking at climate change in this lecture today. For those of you who are health professionals, please be aware that we have all your details from registration, and the system is recording your presence. So within the next week or so, we should be able to get your CPD certificates to you. The way we will proceed is as usual. After a brief introduction, our speaker will do the presentation, and thereafter we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Please, would you capture your questions in the Q&A box, and we will then respond to them from there. So don't use the chat if you can help it. It's much easier if we only have to watch one of these things. So please do capture your questions in the Q&A. So our speaker this afternoon is Melissa Fourie. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Rights, which is a non-profit public interest law organization of activist lawyers who work with communities and civil society organizations in South Africa to realize our constitutional right to a healthy environment by advocating and litigating for environmental justice. Prior to her current position, Melissa started her professional career in 1998 as an attorney. She's worked for the Research and Policy Unit of the South African Country Office of the IUCN, the World Conservation Unit, as well as Director of Enforcement at the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism. In 2020, she was appointed to the Climate Change Commission by the President of South Africa. Melissa holds BA LLB degrees from the University of Stellenbosch and an MSc in Environmental Development from the London School of Economics. So without further ado, I hand over to Melissa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Steve Biko Center of Bioethics for the privilege of delivering this lecture. And to everyone who's dialed in, thank you all for your presence here today. Let me start by, excuse me, expressing a sense of humility about speaking in this forum at the University of the Witwatersrand. I'm deeply honored to be invited to deliver this lecture because I am, of course, not an academic. My career in legal practice, environmental law enforcement, in activism and nonprofit management has been one of practice and of implementation. That kind of career does not allow as much time for intellectual reflection and academic inquiry as I would like. Perhaps that still lies ahead for me in the second half of my career. So being asked to compose a lecture like the one I deliver here today is a gift of significance. This is not to say that I'm going to attempt academic analysis of any depths in this talk. While I rely on and deeply respect the academic project, I'm also the daughter of an academic. I am ultimately an activist working for social change, and so this talk will therefore be intensely political. For that reason, I dedicate this lecture to the activists who have died for their climate justice activism just in the last 6 years. Bazuka Radebe, Mamfikile Nshangase, Nokutula Mabaso, Ayanda Ngila, Lindukuhle Mguni, and other urban justice activists at Abahlali, Basemjondolo in KwaZulu-Natal. Secondly, and most importantly, I am profoundly humbled to be associated, even in the most passing and peripheral way, with one of the great intellectuals of our time, Bantu Stephen Biko. Growing up as a white girl child in apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s, I was at the time ignorant of the intense political revolution, intellectual and political revolution lit by Biko and others around Black consciousness. In fact, the very existence and murder of Biko, his thoughts, his words, and were hidden from children like me, impoverishing our understanding of our country, of the world, and of the human experience. It was only due to the political exposure of my older sister in the late 1980s and early 1990s that I became aware of the life, power, and influence of Biko. Now in the 2020s, as a leader in the public interest law and social justice sector of South Africa, working to progress social, environmental, and climate justice, Biko's seminal work, I Write What I Like, is etched into my psyche, primarily as I strive not to be one of the white liberals Biko wrote about so searingly in chapter 5. His legacy lives on in so many ways. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Environmental Rights for their comments on drafts of this lecture and for their support here today. Also to my colleagues and comrades in the climate justice movement, whose work I have relied on for this lecture. And finally, a word of thanks to my husband, who took over extra family responsibilities to give me time to write this. I am here because of all of you. In this lecture, I will address the issue of climate trauma and the South African context. I will then discuss climate justice and if and how we find it in the midst of the climate crisis. I will also touch on the complex challenges of technological solutions versus returning to the understanding of our role in our human and non-human communities and the strength we find in reconnection with those communities and with ourselves. Witnessing and living in the time of climate change is a profoundly traumatic experience. It is shocking first, because it is not as if climate change has happened without warning. We have known about the climate crisis to come for decades. We have known what is causing the crisis. We have known how to stop it, or at least to slow it down. And yet, such climate action as we have taken over these many decades collectively can reasonably be described as far too little and far too late. For climate scientists, for indigenous people, and for activists who have been paying attention to the science and the warning signs, this is surely the ultimate disempowerment, knowing the truth, seeing the harm, but being unable to prevent what has now become at least partly inevitable. What we are witnessing is a fundamental shift in the natural context that our species has taken for granted and on which we rely for the way we live and have organized ourselves on this planet. The shift will lead to changes to our natural and social environments that are and will become so deep that they will fundamentally change the way we think about our past, how we experience our present, and how we plan for our future. When to expect rains to fall or winds to blow, what to plant and at what time, where we can live safely and for how long we are likely to live, how and to where we can travel, who will be living around us, who will be in positions of power over us, whether we will have the courage to have children and families at all. One of the greatest obstacles to an appropriate collective human response to the climate crisis is disengagement. The list of harmful impacts of climate change is a long one, and many people struggle to engage with and accept what is happening. In her 2014 book, This Changes Everything, author Naomi Klein describes her own version of climate denial, which may sound familiar to you, looking for a split second and then looking away, or looking and then turning it into a joke about the apocalypse, or looking and telling ourselves, quote, comforting stories about how humans are clever and will come up with a technological miracle that will safely suck the carbon out of the skies or magically turn down the heat of the sun, close quote. She writes, or maybe we do look, really look, but then inevitably we seem to forget, remember and then forget again. Climate change is like that. It's hard to keep in your head for very long. We deny because we fear that letting in the full reality of this crisis will change everything. And we are right, close quote. The 2021 comedy disaster film, Don't Look Up, powerfully showed us a populace desperate for distraction from inevitable doom, choosing to immerse themselves in the trivial love lives of celebrities rather than literally looking up at the comet about to obliterate the planet. For the next few minutes, what you will hear may sound like a litany of doom and destruction, but I ask you to try to not disengage, because we need to talk about climate change and climate trauma. As Don't Look Up shows us so tragicomically, denialism and disconnection and disengagement and distraction are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And where we are right now in 2022, climate change is not the apocalypse. There is so much that we can do, not only to turn the tide, but to prepare ourselves for the future. But we can only design collective solutions and put ourselves on a path to climate justice if we understand what is happening. Climate scientist Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who spends much of her time doing popular education on climate change with skeptical constituencies, writes, quote, "That's why the single most important thing that I do, and that you can do too, has nothing to do with solar panels or food or recycling or light bulbs. The most important thing every single one of us can do about climate change is talk about it, why it matters and how we can fix it, and use our voices to advocate for change within our spheres of influence. As a parent, child, family member or friend, student, employee or boss, shareholder, stakeholder, member or citizen, connecting with one another is how we change ourselves, how we change others, and ultimately how we change the world. It's contagious," close quote. So what can we expect from climate change in South and Southern Africa for the rest of the century? Well, firstly, average temperatures in the region are increasing at twice the average global rate. What is heading our way is decreased mean annual rainfall, prolonged droughts, decreased soil moisture, heat waves and increased wildfires, but also more intensive and severe rainfall events in the eastern part of the country, and an increased likelihood of tropical cyclones in the northeast. In 2021, the Center for Environmental Rights, on behalf of environmental justice groups, the African Climate Alliance, Bokani Environmental Justice Movement, and Groundwork, commissioned a series of expert reports in support of a piece of litigation that we've named the Cancel Coal case. This court case asks the court to set aside government plans to procure electricity from any new coal-fired power, and yes, enabling the development of more new coal-fired power stations, carbon emissions from which are one of the primary contributors to global warming, is still currently part of the South African government's plans. One of these reports that we commissioned was written by the late Professor Bob Scholes and Professor Francois Engelbrecht from the Global Change Institute here at the University of the Witwatersrand, both globally respected climate scientists who have contributed to reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In their report entitled Climate Impacts in Southern Africa in the 21st Century, they describe impacts that include a high likelihood that agricultural production in Southern Africa, including staple crops and livestock, will be reduced relative to the no climate change case. This is because the region is already beyond the temperature optimum for most crop and livestock production, and crop and forage production in an already dry country decreases if soil moisture decreases further. These impacts increase as the level of global warming increases, and at 3 degrees of global warming, the collapse of key crops and the livestock sector is likely. Freshwater availability, already critically limited in Southern Africa, will be reduced in future as a result of decreasing rainfall and increasing evaporation. Water quality also decreases in a warmer, drier Southern Africa, increasing the risk of waterborne disease. The increased likelihood of long-duration droughts, overwhelming historical coping mechanisms. The number, intensity, and duration of heat waves in South Africa will increase steeply in the future. As a result, the capacity to perform manual labor out of doors decreases dramatically, and human mortality increases, particularly in urban areas with inadequate housing. On the other hand, in some locations, we can expect decreases in mortality as a result of fewer cold spells. The risk of severe storms, including intense tropical cyclones and very intense thunderstorms, increases with climate change in Southern Africa. As a result, loss of life, injury, and damage to infrastructure also increases. In South Africa, principally due to habitat loss and degradation, 14% of plants, 17% of mammals, and 15% of birds are currently classified as threatened with extinction. Thousands of species, many occurring only in Southern Africa, are at increased risk of premature extinction as a result of human-induced climate change. In a second report in the series of reports commissioned for the Council Coal Case entitled Climate Change Implications for South Africa's Youth, global change analyst and strategist Professor Nicholas King considered what we can expect life to be like from 2021 to 2100 in the Western Cape, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga, respectively. He describes the physical and social climate trauma that is predicted in different future scenarios, depending on the degree of global warming, which includes increasing conflict over scarce water, with those communities already underserved remaining so, conflicts with neighboring countries over shared river basin resources and diminishing supplies, severe risks to children's development, education, gender equity, and safety, with children, girls in particular, spending longer hours assisting with food production and or procurement, fetching water for their families, extreme heat waves leading to rising numbers of morbidities and mortalities, especially amongst the young, the infirm, and the elderly, rapidly expanding informal settlements, including in-migration from countries to the north as climate change impacts compromised livelihood across the region, with conflicts and xenophobia leading to violence. There's also increased fire risks for informal settlements, something we're very familiar with already. Disaster relief that is overstretched and unable to reach most people, and a loss of a sense of place and identity through dramatic changes in people's surroundings, the breakdown of social ties and cultural connections as they are forced to move, to try and survive, and to access services such as healthcare, education, and social grants. In Southern Africa, what used to be models and predictions are starting to become reality to even the most cynical, as climate change is rapidly increasing the likelihood of extreme weather events. It has been estimated that anthropogenic climate change increased the likelihood of the 2015 to 2017 rainfall deficit in southwestern South Africa, the 3 consecutive years dry winters that resulted in the Cape Town Day Zero crisis in early 2018 by a factor of 5 to 6. The Eastern Cape has similarly experienced a severe drought since 2015, causing great hardship, and research indicates the likelihood of winter becoming wetter and summer becoming drier. In 2019, tropical cyclone Idai brought winds of up to 215 kilometers an hour and caused severe flooding in Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Idai obliterated infrastructure in the port city of Beira in Mozambique, and it's estimated to have killed at least 1,300 people and affected millions of people in the region. This year, during the period 8 to 12 April 2022, most of KwaZulu-Natal saw more than 50 millimeters of rain, with coastal areas recording more than 200 millimeters. It was reported that in a 24-hour period spanning 11 to 12 April, as much as 307 millimeters of precipitation was recorded in some areas, which is more than 4 times the normal amount for the entire month of April. More than 400 people died and many others remain unaccounted for. Billions of rands of damage to infrastructure was recorded, raising difficult questions about the lack of climate preparedness in the eThekwini metro, but also in struggling metros across the country, struggling local authorities across the country. The World Weather Attribution Initiative has concluded that the probability of an event such as the rainfall that resulted in the KZN floods has approximately doubled due to human-induced climate change, and that the intensity of the current event was increased by up to 8%. Critically, in their reports, Professor Skold and Engelbrecht will point out that, quote, the climate will continue to change throughout the 21st century to a degree mostly determined by human actions and the policies that guide them. In other words, close quote, in other words, whether we stay below 1.5 degrees global mean warming or only briefly exceed it, or whether we enter into a 2 or 3 degrees or even more world is in our hands. I will return to this call to action again later. So against this background, what do we mean by climate trauma? Generally, climate trauma refers to the psychological impacts of climate change and impacts on people's mental and social well-being. Climate trauma is a growing body of research, and across the world, psychologists and public health services are already struggling to meet the demands of a growing climate anxiety, particularly amongst young people. A 2021 study of 10,000 children and young people between ages 16 and 25 in 10 countries showed that 59% of respondents were very or extremely worried, and 84% were at least moderately worried about climate change. More than 50% reported feeling sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, or guilty. And more than 45% said their feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily life and functioning. 75% said that they think the future is frightening. And 83% said that they think people have failed to take care of the planet. Respondents rated governmental responses to climate change negatively and reported greater feelings of betrayal than of reassurance. In a third report in the series of reports commissioned for the Cancel Coal case entitled The Psychological and Mental Health Consequences of Climate Change in South Africa, clinical psychologist and researcher Dr. Garrett Barnwell describes how people experience climate change through a range of traumatic and stressful events, and how exposure to these events lead to well-understood psychopathologies, including anxiety, depression, suicide, interpersonal violence, decreased work productivity, and increased hospitalization, amongst other things. He says that climate change exposures can be experienced directly or vicariously through witnessing others suffer. It can also be experienced as anticipated harms, which may be accumulative over a person's lifetime. The KZN floods of April 2022 left many families reeling from the loss, and civil society organizations stepped in to provide psychosocial support to survivors. Human rights news agency Ground Up reported the story of the Dalozi family in Durban who had lost 10 family members in the floods. By early August 2022, only 9 of the victims had been found, and the family feared that the body of 14-year-old Lusanda Dalozi would never be found. Thokozani Mdalozi is quoted as saying the following: "The sad thing is we cannot blame anyone for this. I have stopped going to church and praying. What do I say to God when I'm feeling so much pain? I doubt I will ever heal from all of this." Dr. Barnwell highlights impacts on children who are likely to have extra challenges at school as their concentration and emotional well-being are harmed. Quote, "Children can turn these feelings inward and experience profound sadness, loss, helplessness, or hopelessness, or they can turn these feelings outwards in destructive ways. It is not only the negative experiences that the children and individuals have, but what these experiences can take away from them. Hope, happiness, a sense of self-worth, and trust in the world can be challenged and dulled." Trust is an issue that has arisen time and again in the work that is currently being undertaken by the Presidential Climate Commission. In a series of public meetings held in communities affected by the transition from coal and by climate change, the breakdown of trust between people and the state, particularly during the time of state capture, was a recurring theme. Community members expressed a sense of neglect, abandonment, and betrayal by government, particularly at a local level. Another recurring theme during those engagements, which took place in April 2022, was the poor relationships between communities and civil society organizations on the one hand, and corporations, particularly those in the fossil fuel sector, on the other. Communities expressed distress about the health impacts of air pollution in particular, while being excluded from employment opportunities and indeed any of the profits made by those fossil fuel companies at their expense. Greenwashing by corporations further erodes trust in the corporate sector, as many big emitters and their financiers try to deny or downplay their contribution to global warming, even continuing to expand their profit-taking through acceleration of coal mining to cash in on the massive increase in the coal price, or continuing to finance the East African crude oil pipeline while distracting from their inadequate climate action through advertising campaigns and public relations stakeholder engagement strategies. And yet trust between all stakeholders is also a major precondition for the type of collective action that is required to transition to a post-carbon world. So far, I've given you a broad overview of the causes of climate trauma contextualized for Southern Africa. I think you'll agree with me in the cold light of day that the scope and depth of this trauma does not bode well for an effective collective climate response, particularly with climate trauma building on the pre-existing historical injustice and divisions in our society. But with gritty optimism, I would now like to move on to talk about climate justice and explore ways in which understanding and addressing the root of climate trauma can also pave the way to a more just and equal climate resilient society. Climate justice is about far more than halting carbon emissions that cause global warming or adapting to such changes to the climate that are now inevitable. Climate justice recognizes that carbon emissions and global warming are only the manifestation of the real cause of climate change. At the root of the climate crisis, we find injustice and inequality, a fundamental distortion of humans' relationship with the planet and with each other. The term climate justice then signals that climate change is not an environmental issue. It interacts with social systems, entrenched privileges and injustices, and it affects people across class, race, gender, geography, and generation unequally. The fact that those who are most impacted by climate change tend to be those least responsible for causing it is both a cause and an effect of global warming. Climate justice assumes that the climate crisis cannot be addressed without addressing the underlying and intersectional inequality of our economic, political, and social systems. Without venturing into the large body of work by prominent writers and historians on the wily and complex ways in which our current systems of politics and philosophy and economics and law have over centuries shaped the conditions that made climate change a reality, what I do know is this: the current system of extractive exploitation of both people and planet to benefit the few, based on hegemonic economic theories and models, no longer serves us and our future on this planet, if they ever did. And therein, of course, lies an immense opportunity. Is it possible that in the excess of this crisis, there is opportunity for a tectonic shift into a more just, more equal, more climate resilient global society? That we can have a just transition into a world where we live within our planetary and social boundaries, where everyone, including in particular Black people and people of color, women, non-binary people, LGBTQI+ people, people living with disability, young people, can prosper, where no one is left behind. I would put it in stronger terms. This is the one chance we have to make this shift towards climate justice, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to choose resilience and prosperity for the many on this planet over the obscene extractive wealth of the few. So how do we move forward towards a tipping point? While a fundamental restructure of our social, political, governance, and legal system goes well beyond the scope of this talk, in the second part of my lecture, I want to focus on the concept of reconnection and what that could offer us in forging a world in which we can have climate justice. Reconnection often refers to the concept of joining or being joined to something after a time of not being joined, usually in the context of a power supply. Are very appropriate then to think about reconnection as a way to access power once again, the power of nature, the power of community, and the true power of understanding our connection to the planet. Where better to go to find advice on reconnecting to nature than the work of Indigenous communities and activists? Indigenous people have been speaking for a long time, often without being heard, about the danger of ignoring and forgetting that we are part of nature. For Indigenous people in many parts of the world, the oceans, the trees, the insects, the birds and animals, the grass that make up our miraculous ecosystems are not removed from us. They are our kin, our family. Without them, we are nothing. We are untethered and depleted. Many Indigenous activists describe their own climate trauma as a loss of family members, a loss of community culture, of a way of life. In the recent court case of Sustaining the Wild Coast and Others versus the Minister of Mineral Resources and Shell, activists and Wild Coast residents in Igugu Zukulu stated in his affidavit to court that, quote, as is often the case with Indigenous peoples, the land belongs to us, but we also belong to the land. It sustains us and is central to our identity. He states, The Wild Coast is a place of stunning natural beauty. Unlike other coastal stretches in South Africa, Indigenous people have maintained continuous possession of this land, despite waves of colonial and apartheid aggression. This is no accident. Our ancestors' blood was spilt protecting our land and sea. We now feel a sense of duty to protect our land and sea for future generations, as well as for the benefit of the planet. Our land and sea are central to our livelihoods and our way of life. Over generations, we have conserved them, and they have conserved us. This is not merely a matter of nutrition and income, though it certainly is that. Some of our ancestors reside in the sea, and our traditional healers and pastors use the sea to heal us and to connect us with God. Just as Indigenous people have deliberately worked to retain their connection to nature, the loss of connection to nature for almost everyone else has not been accidental. It is part of a centuries-old, premeditated project which has achieved success of epic proportions to build a global sense of inferiority about local and Indigenous systems and beliefs, and a sense of superiority in Western methodologies and technological solutions. Because how would we be persuaded to fuel the capitalist system, to power the machines that extract coal and metals and rip open land for commercial forestry and agriculture, if we understand the trees and grass to be our family members? We had to be made to believe that human individuals are more important than nature and community, and that extraction favors the strongest individuals, that colonialism brought us progress, that patriarchy and white supremacy were part of the natural order of things. Because of those, if those statements were false, as they are, capitalists could not profit from the extraction and exploitation of nature, of working people, of Black people, and of women. Thus far, we have whittled away our connection to nature to ideas of sustainable development, environmental impact assessment, and the precautionary principle, without wasting any time on how inadequate the interpretation and application of those principles and concepts have been. Suffice it to say that our management of environmental impacts to date has brought us to the brink of climate collapse. We are going to have to do so much better. If it is internalized oppression of our kinship relationships with nature, of our Indigenous systems and practices that have enabled our participation in the system of extraction and exploitation of nature and our communities, can we use the concept of being good ancestors to become allies for the natural family that sustains us all? Jonas Salk, the American virologist who developed one of the first polio vaccines, famously said in 1967, "If we want to be good ancestors, we should show future generations how we coped with an age of great change and great crises." This idea of ancestry and its connection to future generation lies at the heart of the climate crisis. It is our willingness to focus only on what is happening here and now, and our inability to develop empathy for future generations that has allowed capitalist extractivism to flourish. Some Indigenous communities, understanding that communities can and should transcend time, adopt a philosophy of seventh generation decision-making, the principle that any decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. How different our world would look today. Clearly, what I'm describing here are not the efforts of individuals acting alone. It is only through mass mobilization, whether through protest, through consumer action, or the democratic process, that we will see the change we need. But more than that, we are also going to need our communities if we are to adapt to a rapidly changing climate, as is evident from the climate-exacerbated extreme events we have seen just in the past few years. Therefore, the second part of reconnection relates to reconnection with our communities and simultaneously reconceptualizing who our communities are. Community resilience is a complex issue in different contexts, and underlying socio-cultural factors can shape who is involved and what outcomes emerge. Clearly, it is not helpful to be naive about the extent of breakdown of community connection, both locally and globally. In South Africa, we have a complex relationship with the concept of community, marred by inclusion and exclusion, and varied experiences of the ways in which apartheid and the years since have damaged our social fabric. As activists, community is essential for mobilization for change, and it both provides protection and poses danger for many activists. The ever-present risk of xenophobia and xenophobic violence bubbles under the surface in so many communities in South Africa, a situation that is likely going to be aggravated by the anticipated increase in climate refugees over the decades to come. However, even in South Africa, with all the damage done to our social fabric, and without overstating the impact of these initiatives, in times of crisis, we do see people reach out to find connection. We saw that during Day Zero in Cape Town in 2017, 2018, and we saw it again during the COVID pandemic, when hundreds of community action networks, or CANs, arose in response to the economic impacts of the initial lockdown. According to a 2021 University of the Western Cape School of Public Health report, quote, the movement of CANs was initiated by a small team of social justice activists, community workers, and public health specialists who knew that a coordinated and robust community response would be fundamental to confronting the challenges of COVID-19, many of which would not be clinical or health related at all, but rather socioeconomic. The idea behind the initiative was that any group of ordinary residents, no matter their background, training, or means, could come together and start a CAN in their own neighborhood. Within a few weeks, hundreds of CANs had appeared across the city, spanning the usual divides that have come to characterize Cape Town: racial, spatial, and class-based, close quote. The CANs responded to problems of hunger through community kitchens, as well as education around COVID protocols, facilitating cross-CAN workshops and events, and recording of and reflection on experiences. In the aftermath of the floods in Durban in April 2022, it soon became clear that eThekwini Metro was battling to respond to the unprecedented damage to infrastructure and services. Residents started forming associations to try to fix broken roads and bridges. A group of 10 residents known as Team Pompene from Shallcross, south of Durban, reportedly rebuilt a bridge across the Klatuzana River at the North Dean border, a route that serves thousands of residents daily, for 25,000 Rand in 4 days. The Shallcross community has reportedly also secured ambulance services to respond to emergencies, rapid response security services, and food aid and disaster response teams. While effectively circumventing and replacing local government is clearly not a long-term solution, and one would also have to ask questions about the inclusivity of initiatives like that, it is also critical to accept and embrace the fact that few local governments anywhere in the world are likely to be adequately resourced to respond to climate emergencies. In particular, they will not be resourced to respond in a way that promotes climate justice. Yes, true climate adaptation and resilience requires a complete overhaul of policy and decision-making in all spheres, but it is also going to require resilient communities that are connected and resourced to respond to expected and unexpected events. At the same time, the communities we talk about are increasingly no longer just local communities. In the most recent floods in Pakistan, which has left a third of the country underwater and more than 1,300 people dead, hundreds of thousands of people left homeless, and affecting 33 million people, we see the Pakistani diaspora step up to support their communities of origin in Pakistan. On the other hand, the lackluster global response to the Pakistan floods also highlights the starkly inferior global support reserved for countries in the global south. Reflecting on her community's response to Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico in 2017, killing nearly 3,000 people, Puerto Rican activist Christine E. Neves Rodriguez writes, quote, and that's when we looked at our work and we realized we are building a different and better Puerto Rico. We are building it because when everything collapsed, it was crystal clear what was the real infrastructure and what was an insubstantial facade. When everything collapses, the life-saving infrastructure is our knowledge of one another's skills, our trust of one another, our capacity to forgive our neighbor, work with our neighbor, and mobilize. When everything collapses, no ATMs, no water, no food, no diesel, no communication, you have to tap into a pre-existing system of trust and dignity and reciprocity. When disasters happen, the person right in front of you is your best chance at survival. That's when we understood the times we will be facing are going to require us to recognize that the most important thing around us is community. As you're listening to me today, ask yourself who that community is for you and what you can do to strengthen the diversity, skills and resilience of that community. Give special thought to young people and how we can best harness the energy and vision of young people in our communities, those young people who will be inheriting the planet after us and who are telling us how anxious they are about their future. I conclude this lecture with a few remarks about the role of technology in the transition to a post-carbon future and in achieving climate justice. There is no doubt that technology will continue to develop and could ease our path of transition to a post-carbon world. We are entering a time of great innovation and creativity. We look particularly to major developments in battery storage and carbon absorption technologies, but there are many other aspects of living in a post-carbon world at stake, whether we like these or not. Aeroplanes and ships powered by non-fossil fuel sources, hologram communication to limit the need for time and energy-consuming travel, genome editing to prevent or treat disease or to produce more adaptive crops. Such technological advances have the potential of transforming the lives of people and of progressing the goal of climate justice. New communication technologies can also connect us and enable the creation of those diverse and resilient communities I referred to earlier. But technology can also take us in the wrong direction and continue to widen the global inequality gap. To a large degree, the technology we need to address the immediate reduction in global carbon emission exists. It's proven and it's cheaper than its fossil fuel alternative. One would think that this is the end of this initial discussion. Not so. Those of us agitating for the carbon emissions cuts prescribed by science continue to be confronted with new proposals to avoid the inevitable emissions cuts. A particular bone of contention is the now ubiquitous goal of net zero, in which is concealed a reliance on the future viability of technologies that are yet unproven to be feasible at scale, including carbon capture and storage. Surely, pegging the commitment of major carbon emitters to urgent and imperative emissions reductions, on which the future of life on this planet literally hangs, to a target that remains at this stage fanciful, has major ethical implications for the corporate sector and for all those promoting the goal of net zero. It also fundamentally negates the precautionary principle. There are many other geoengineering solutions that are receiving attention and investment funding, some of which may assist and some of which may pose additional risks, including the use of technologies to avoid the essential emission reductions that science tells us is required. In the shocking first chapter of the 2020 climate fiction novel, The Ministry for the Future, author Kim Stanley Robinson imagines a future in where Paris Agreement targets have already been overshot. India, angered by an extreme heat wave that kills 20 million people, decides to embark on a, quote, solar radiation management action, sending up swarms of aeroplanes to pump sulfate aerosols high in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight away from the Earth. Even in the novel, this action, which poses its own risks, as you can imagine, is highly controversial, since it entails India breaking a global agreement not to conduct any atmospheric interventions without consultation and agreement with other countries. Ensuring that technology progresses climate justice and benefits all instead of a few is not going to happen without effort. It will only happen if we, as citizens of the planet, insist that to be the case. If we don't, we will continue to have billionaires flying rockets into space, while billions of people live without energy security or adequate water and sanitation. In the words of American abolitionist Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. What is required of us now in 2022 is vigilance and setting aside the distractions designed to tame and mute us, to push us over the tipping point towards climate justice in a post-carbon world. We will need to do more than just survive the rapidly changing climate, more than hunkering down in our individual bunkers with a flickering phone. We need collective action based on seventh generation decision-making, powered by our reconnection to nature and our reconceptualized community. A new ethic of intersectional justice that can bring us a fairer, more resilient new world. It is appropriate for me to end this lecture with the words of two feminist climate authors, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson, who write the following in their introduction to their collection of essays entitled All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. Quote, what we want to tip toward is community, care, repair, and renewal. We want to tip toward life. While it is too late to save everything, some ecological damage is irreparable. Some species are already gone. Ice has already melted. Lives have already been lost. It is far too soon to give up on the rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yeah, I was reminded as you were pointing to the importance of reconnection and some of the wisdom that comes from Indigenous communities, how in the early days of the environmental ethics movement, which certainly have been around since about the 60s as a specialized field, that the focus was on having to change our philosophy, our understanding of how we view the world and nature, and change it from a position of thinking that we have control over it and it belongs to us, to something in which we respect other living beings as well. And it also reminded me of Kwasi Wiredu, one of the most prolific of all African philosophers, who said that of all the duties owed to the ancestors, none is more imperious than that of husbanding the resources of the land so as to leave it in good shape for posterity. And it does just remind me that we do have to focus not just on our own experience, but also our responsibility to those who will follow us in the future. Thanks so much. As I said, people, please would you put your questions into the Q&A. We have just one so far, so please do add some others in the meantime. And the first question we have is from Naweji, and it's quite a deep question. Climate change has been cited as one of the causes of the annihilation of our earlier ancestors, for instance, the Neanderthals. As Homo sapiens, we seem to be experiencing clear signs of our own imminent destruction. Question is, are we not fighting a losing battle or simply trying to slow down the inevitable end of an era? And if or when we get extinct, are there any predictions of the novel and wiser two-legged species to come after we have long gone?
Thanks, thanks, Kevin. That is indeed a very big question, and you know, it seems to allude to a little bit of the kind of arguments that say, you know, we've seen changes in the climate before, and you know, this is just another phase, which you know. As you know, I'm a lawyer, not a scientist, but my understanding as a scientist is that we've never seen this kind of human influence, this kind of change caused by human action in the history of humanity. Sorry, I kind of didn't quite get the second part of the question of two-legged species. Let me just see if I can find the Q&A myself. Gosh, I see there are a whole lot of things in here. Question, are we not fighting a losing battle, simply trying to slow down the inevitable end of an era? Well, I mean, I think that was kind of what I was talking to in the lectures, really, that the evidence is compelling that there is so much more that we can do. I think people understand, and as I was saying, that some of the changes are what we call baked in. So we've gone beyond certain points already. But at the same time, there is so much more that can be done. An immediate reduction in, and kind of elimination of carbon emissions will obviously have a huge impact. And of course, we also know that some greenhouse gases are much more potent than others, for example, methane. So there's a lot of action that can be taken to turn to at least, it will really fundamentally affect the level of impact into this next century. But yeah, it's also true that, it's often said that it's not, if the planet will survive, it is whether our society and communities can survive. That is the real challenge.
Thank you. Don't see any other questions at the moment. So please, everyone, if you do have any, here's one more that has come through. What about the windfall tax on exploitative corporations as a means to justice?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is a topic close to my heart. And it really also is, links to, a very well-established critique of capitalism and the way it operates, is that when things are going really well and a lot of profits are being made, those profits will go to shareholders of companies. But when that company is finding itself in a hard time, there'll be calls for government bailouts, as we've seen so powerfully over the past few decades, including in 2008. And so there's a real question about this, whether it is acceptable to see this kind of profit taking, first of all, just from an economic point of view, whether that is appropriate given the known harms that are coming from the burning of that fossil fuel, but also just, as I say, it's about the swings and roundabouts, right? But I think there's also a very big, and of course the amount that the fiscus is going to need to respond to some of these climate impacts. I mean, we can see the types of amounts that are being used in the context of the KZN floods, billions and billions of rands that we need, and that is probably an underestimation, and that's just one metro. So, but I think there's also a very big ethical question around profit taking from a spike in the coal price that comes from a decrease in supply, and of course what's happening in Ukraine and in Europe as a result of that conflict, and whether it is appropriate for companies to do that, to make those kind of profits. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that with anonymous attendee. That's something that certainly we are thinking and talking about as activists.
Thanks. So the next question is from Danielle. Do human rights play a role in assessment of development, and how can individuals bring this narrative into management approaches?
I mean, as a human rights lawyer, of course, I think that human rights should be part of every conversation, and certainly in the context of any kind of development model. How can individuals bring this narrative into management approaches? I mean, it's interesting, the kind of it's taken a bit of time for the concept of human rights to really find themselves entrenched in corporate business practices. But I do also, want to say that I think often that is not real. I think it's easy to talk about human rights without really embracing the types of issues that I was talking about here today, really the fundamental issues of social and climate justice. I think it hides a lot of kind of unethical approaches in many instances. So it is useful, particularly because we have our constitution and because we have human rights instruments globally that we can use, particularly when we're dealing with multinational corporations. But I think it's also important to look behind those concepts and really look at to what degree is it just a question of prevention of violations if we're lucky, or whether that actually progresses social and other forms of justice.
So then there's a question from Kim. My personal opinion is that if everyone became vegetarian, there would be a fundamental reduction in environmental destruction. Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, it is certainly true that meat production is a major contributor, and I think it's pretty clear now that it's really the second area of intervention after fossil fuel reductions, and so absolutely, I take a relatively pragmatic view about this, in the sense that eating more vegetarian and less meat is also important. So because this is such a like inherently cultural issue, what people eat, it's a very complex thing to navigate. And I like to promote an approach that says, let's explore the wonderful things about vegetarian food, and rather than putting in place a ban, although it is not impossible that lies in our future. I think to some degree the market will dictate that as meat will become more expensive. But it is definitely something that we might see in future, and that you see that often also written about in science fiction, that is a potential lying ahead, a possibility of meat becoming basically having to be banned to save the planet. Hopefully we can prevent that before we get there.
Right, and then there's a question: how well does the Just Transition Framework address the issue of climate trauma and climate justice? What more is needed to address these?
Yeah, so I think that question refers to the Just Transition Framework that's been developed by the Presidential Climate Commission, which has now been adopted by Cabinet. As far as I can recall, the framework, it clearly talks about climate justice. I think it also talks about mental health impacts. The framework is a framework. It is not a detailed implementation plan for the just transition. So I think there's some very interesting work that needs to be done around public health responses, essentially to climate change and to the transition itself. It is something that, the idea of looking at climate impacts or climate health impacts from a psychological point of view is actually relatively new. And also because the physical health issues are so overwhelming. But it is clear that it's going to have to be a big issue big part of the discussion. And the reality is that, we did some work around this with some of our partner organizations like Section 27. And it is clear that we are not in any way prepared. Our public health systems are not in any way prepared to respond to these kinds of issues. So it's really going to be it's an interesting time, and it's an interesting time for public health professionals and those particularly specializing in psychology and psychiatry, is how one deals with the hugely growing need around this.
Thanks. We are actually out of time, but we do still have 3 questions. Are you happy to take those quickly, or?
Sure. They look tough. Maybe I need to be somewhere else. No, it's okay. I can stay on.
All right. So, which civil society groups in South Africa do you feel are making the most progress in the right directions? Also, it is really hard to invest in ESG funds in South Africa. All of us with retirement savings are complicit in some way. Do you have any suggestions of how to avoid inadvertently supporting the big bad wolves out there?
Gosh, let me start with that second part. That is, of course, a problem that, it's very, very difficult to do what we would regard as truly responsible investment. I think that is shifting. I'm not a huge expert in this field. I don't work on it every day. But I do think that, and certainly we face these same issues, right? All of us activists, those of us who are fortunate enough to have some savings, and it's not all of us, you know, what do we do with those funds, and how do we make sure that we are not investing in those fossil fuel companies, or indirectly, you know, if you're investing in the banks are supporting the fossil fuel companies or financing them or giving them facilities. You know, it's really difficult, and it's really an overdue intervention by the financial sectors to provide us with appropriate investment vehicles. So yeah, that would be a massive intervention to really expand that area. And my understanding is that the evidence is compelling that we can actually get as good, if not better, returns from those types of investments. I mean, just bear in mind that we've got we need as South Africa to build at least 5 gigawatts of renewable energy over the next until 2030 every year. That is a massive infrastructure build, which is also partly going to be funded privately, largely going to be funded privately. So massive opportunities also to support those initiatives. In terms of what civil society groups in South Africa are making most progress, I mean, that's a fascinating question, probably a topic for a whole nother talk. You know, I think the reality is to achieve real change, we need to have an unusual alliance of groups working together towards the same goal, even if the work that is being done for different reasons. Right, that is how we see major social change, and so you know, we don't normally regard labor unions as part of civil society, but they have a massive role to play in relation to this, both in terms of their own membership, but also in terms of their own investments. From within sort of traditional civil society, you know, the thing is we need to, and that's probably also overworked, is that we're trying to cover so many bases, right? There are many of us, some people that I've referred to in this talk, who are working in the litigation space, who are using the law and using the constitution to move things in the right direction, to cut off things going in the wrong direction. Then we have people who are doing shareholder activism, who are turning up at annual general meetings, who are assessing integrated reports of corporations, who are challenging them to produce Paris-aligned emissions reductions plans. It has to happen at all of these levels, right? If we're going to achieve that kind of change. And then, of course, there's a huge amount of work being done by community activists on the ground in their communities, filling a gap that government really should be filling around educating people as to what lies in their future and what choices they have to choose, what options they have to choose between. You know, it's really an area that's very underserviced, you know. To give the sort of the essence of empowerment is an agency is for people to understand what lies in their future so that they can plan and prepare accordingly. So those are also very, very important areas and very important work that's being done at great personal cost by many, many community activists. There's a question here about the climate change bill. How can we, ordinary people, try to influence this to ensure sufficient and able climate justice? Yes, this is a really important and pressing issue, is the climate change bill that's currently in Parliament. There's fantastic work being done already by civil society organizations to really push for a progressive, ambitious climate bill that will really set up an entirely new framework for managing mitigation, but also adaptation for climate. You know, obviously the law is only the beginning. There's a lot to do in implementation and resourcing of the institutions that are being set up and that have to fulfill these obligations under the Act. But that is a very important aspect. And then there's a question of about local governments rising to this moment to protect our country, national government and local governments. Yeah, I think this is, oh gosh, this is a challenging issue. You know, I obviously spent time of my part of my career working inside government, and it's an experience that I wish for many people, because I think it teaches you so much about the difficulties and the challenges of working within the public sector that is very difficult to appreciate from the outside. And it is for sure the case that it is often not government officials who are not wanting to do things. You know, there are many constraints to rolling out effective government plans and programs, you know, partly as a result of what's happened with state capture, etc., but also for other reasons, you know, and so it is. I think that we should not underestimate the kind of commitment and potential and solidarity that we find within many government departments across the country around this. What you do get within government is access to really good information. So many government officials are well aware of all of these issues, and I think would really love to do more if they could. And I think it's important for us as civil society organizations and the private sector as well to support those people, you know, and really help us rebuild some of the governance capacity that we've lost over the last 9-10 years.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. I think we can leave the questions there. And thank you once again for sharing with us. And thank you for the work that you and those you work with are doing to continue to raise consciousness about these issues. And we'll all do our best as well as we move forward. I've recently come across a few books that have been written, one by David Mellendorf, in which the focus has been on to try to suggest that in fact there's some place for hope. Because it's quite easy, I think, to give into a kind of pessimism that this is just too big for us to deal with. And I know that Daryl suggests for one thing that the fact that consequences are now becoming evident will have an impact on people. And he also mentions how the youth are becoming so very concerned about this. And he sees those both as clear signs of hope for the future. And I think looking back on the past, we can see how social change can come quite quickly. People's attitudes can change quite quickly when they sort of develop some kind of movement in a particular direction. So I tend to be a bit of a pessimist myself, but I think we should hold on to the fact that humans are resilient, and that at some stage we'll see sense in all of this. And in the meantime, just do the best that we can. I was very struck when you said that the best thing that we can do is to just keep talking about this. So thank you for that challenge. And thank you everyone for joining us once again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.